last week looking at the story from that movie from 1981 called Chariots of Fire. And we talked about the star of the movie. Well, he wasn't really the star of the movie, but he was who the movie was about, was a British Olympian named Eric Liddell. And Eric Liddell stuck to his convictions and wasn't able to race in the race that he had trained his entire life for because he wanted to remain true to his commitment to God. And in that movie where we talked about Eric and the 1924 Olympics in Paris, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that Eric had this understanding of who he was based on his understanding of who God was and who God said that he was. In fact, he would say this. He actually said this. He said, "I believe God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure." His identity, his life, everything that he did was centered around God. And so even in the disappointment of not being able to run the 100-meter for his gold medal, the race that he had practiced for, he still felt at peace and content knowing God had a plan. But in that race, there was also a second man. In fact, in the story, in the movie, there was a second man. Also a British Olympian, a man named Harold Abrahams. And Harold was just like Eric, trained his entire life for the 100-meter race. But Harold had a different perspective. See, Harold knew that everything that was going to happen, or not knew, but he believed that everything that was going to happen to him was because of him. His entire identity, who he was, his self-worth, was all wrapped up in his identity as an Olympic runner. Now listen to how Harold characterizes his story, his life, and how it differs from Eric's. This is what Harold said. "And now in 1 hour's time, I will be out there again. I will raise my eyes and look down that corridor 4 feet wide with 10 lonely seconds to justify my whole existence." That's what he believed. He had 10 seconds to justify his existence. You see, Eric Liddell believed that what he had, his gift, his ability to run, to be fast, came from God. And so he didn't have to justify his purpose for living. He didn't have to live for the recognition or the applause or the approval of other people. But Harold Abrams, on the other hand, believed that everything that he did, everything he accomplished, everything he received was because of himself. And it was all dependent on him and no one else. And so he had 10 seconds to justify his entire existence. And even when he went on to win the 100 meters in that race, in the Olympics, when he got the Olympic gold, he still found no peace. He didn't find any peace. Now, look, I'm going to guess that for most of us who are here today, most of us who are watching us online today, that most of us aren't going to be trying to justify our existence by competing in the Olympics. It's a very small number of people that are able to do that. But we can carry this same attitude into different areas of our lives. The same attitude of having to justify our existence by what we do. For a lot of us, it's our jobs, it's our careers that we believe justifies our existence, our successes, our accomplishments, our rewards, our bank accounts. Are all those things tell us that we're supposed to be here, that we matter in the world. For other people, it can be their family, their wife or their husband or their children, especially their children. That's what justifies their existence. How successful their children are, the accomplishments that their children make, that's how they measure their worth. Now here's the thing. Those aren't bad things, right? Your career, your job, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Your children, they're good things. Your success, your accomplishments, your rewards, your money and your stuff, those are all good things. Your children, your family, Those are all good things. It's not having success in those areas that can be a problem, but it's when we see them as our entire reason for living, as the measure of our life, as the measure of who we are, the measure of our worth. When we start to see them as that can actually lead us into trouble. Because look, if success in our job is the measure of our worth, then we can easily justify in our minds sabotaging a coworker, even if it is to the detriment of the company, as long as we get ahead. Right? If the success of our business is the measure of our worth, then we can become willing to cut corners. We're willing to cheat our employees or to engage in unethical practices. We'll do whatever it takes for the business to be successful. If successful children are the measure of our worth, then our self-worth, our self-esteem will rise with their successes, but they will also fall with their failures. And while we can have difficulty seeing these things in ourselves, we've seen them in other people. We see it all the time. We've worked with the person that takes all the credit for everything that happens and always pushes the blame off for everything to other people just to make themselves look good, right? We've all probably eaten at a restaurant where the owner doesn't report all their cash sales and steals the tips from their employees. We've been stuck in that conversation with that guy who just talks on and on about his kids, like there's nothing else in the world to talk about except his kids. And in the heart of all of those people is the same thing that Harold Abrams dealt with, and that for all of us, sometime in our life, we're going to deal with. Because when our identity is based on anything other than what God says or who God says we are, then we will never be satisfied with who we are. Which brings us to today's villain. A person you may be familiar with, maybe because this person plays a pivotal role in the Christmas story. His name was Herod. Now, there are several Herods throughout history. There are several Herods mentioned in the scriptures, but I'm talking about the Herod that is known as Herod the Great. Herod the Great was appointed by the Roman Senate to be the caretaker, the king of Judea. And Herod the Great reigned as king of Judea from about 37 BC to about 4 BC. In fact, they actually called Herod the king of the Jews. Now, Herod was a talented and gifted leader. He was a skilled orator. He was a military strategist. He was a shrewd politician. And he was a very skilled builder. In fact, many historians attribute his title, Herod the Great, to the great building projects that he was able to accomplish during his reign. One time he transformed a small, tiny little fishing village called Caesarea into a major military and shipping port, Caesarea Maritima. In fact, if you go to that part of the world today, you can still see the ruins of that military shipping port that he built there. He built what was called the Herodium. It was a Jewish fortress, actually a small city that was built on top of a mountain. About 7.5 miles south of Jerusalem. You can actually still go there today. It was a fortress, but it was also a resort. They talked about how lavish the apartments were that were there. They even had water brought in from far away. They were able to find a way to bring water in to this resort. Another one was the Masada, which was a Jewish fortress on the edge of Jewish territory. In fact, it was the place that during the Jewish revolt in about 74 AD, that the Jews would take their last stand against the Romans. All of those built by Herod the Great. In fact, Herod the Great was the one who undertook the majority of the restoration of the Jerusalem temple, the building of the second temple. He even built what is today known as the Wailing Wall, which is still there today and people still go to from all over the world. He was the one who brought in a regular water supply to Jerusalem. And when the area, that entire region, went through a famine in about 25 to 24 BC, Herod was able to negotiate the purchase of grain from Egypt to make sure that all of the people in Judea would have enough food. See, Herod wasn't a Jew, but he wanted the Jewish people to love him. See, the problem was, though, that he wasn't made king by the Jews. He was appointed by Rome. But despite that, he desperately wanted the Jewish people to accept him as their legitimate king, as their true king. He wanted to be king of the Jews. He even went so far as to be a protector of Judaism. He was a protector of their religion. He wanted their acceptance and their approval, and he never received it, and this infuriated him. But despite all of that, Judea actually prospered during King Herod's reign. During his time, he extended Israel's territory. He defended the edges of the Roman Empire. In fact, Herod was favored by many of the upper class Jewish people. He just became enemies with the religious people, with the Pharisees. He had many of the Sadducees put to death. The religious leaders and the common people did not like Herod. During his reign, there was a civil war, a Roman civil war that broke out. On one side was Mark Antony, who captured most of the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and then there was Octavian, who captured most of the western part of the empire. And in this civil war, Herod sided with Mark Antony. Unfortunately, Mark Antony was defeated by Octavian, who later on would be known as Caesar Augustus. Mark Antony was defeated by Augustus at the Battle of Actium in about 31 BC. And so Herod backed the wrong guy. So you know what Herod did? He sailed to Rhodes to meet Augustus. He sailed to meet the emperor. And he wasn't sure what would happen to him when he got there. But when he got there, he was standing in front of Augustus. He took off his crown and he confessed. He told Augustus that he had supported Mark Antony in their war. Now listen to what he said. According to the ancient historian Josephus, this is what Herod said to Augustus. He said, "I am defeated with Antony, and with his fall I lay aside my crown. I have come to you placing my hope of safety on my unblemished character, and believing that you will wish to know not whose friend, but what sort of friend I have been." Augustus was so impressed with him that not only did he allow Herod to remain king, but he actually even gave Herod more territory than what he originally had. Herod had success. He had power. He had wealth. He had political influence. But because Herod's identity was based on all of those things, on his accomplishments, on his wealth, on his power, on his success, he became overwhelmed with the one thing that we all deal with. He became overwhelmed with fear. The fear of losing all of it. Because if your self-worth is based on your stuff, on your accomplishments, on your success, then you will always have the fear that somebody is going to come along and take it away. It happens to all of us. Herod became fearful that all he had was going to be taken away, and it made him paranoid. And it made him a tyrant who was always worried that he was going to lose his kingdom. Historical records tell us that Herod had 15 children from 10 different wives. But his favorite wife was a woman named Mariamne. Now, Mariamne was the granddaughter of the former high priest, and so she was a Jew. And Herod loved her so much that he gave this instruction to his soldiers, that if he was ever traveling and anything ever happened to him, he wanted his soldiers to kill her. That's how much he loved her. But he also had her parents killed, didn't get along with them. she was getting a little angry with him. She was starting to talk back to him, arguing with him all the time. And so in about 29 BC, he had her tried and convicted and had her executed, his own wife. He was so sad from executing his favorite wife that historians tell us he got sick after that, extremely sick after that. Later on, he would order the execution of Alexander and Aristobulus, two sons from Mariamne, because he became suspicious that they were trying to take away his reign. He also executed another son, Antipater II, who was named after his grandfather, who was a son from another wife. In fact, hearing about all of these things that were happening, Caesar Augustus very famously once said that it was safer to be Herod's pig than to be Herod's son. Herod's accomplishments were great. His successes were great. His wealth and his power were great. His talent and his ability was great. He deserved the title Herod the Great. In fact, many of Herod's building projects would provide the backdrop for many of the events that we read about later in the New Testament. But is Herod primarily remembered for all of that? No. Herod is remembered for his part in the Christmas story. This is what we're going to look at today. This is how the story starts, as recorded by a man named Matthew, one of Jesus' followers, one of his disciples, who wrote an account of everything that happened to Jesus, and this is how he described it. He said, Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of our guy, King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem. Now we know this part of the story, right? The three wise men, they come in looking for the baby Jesus. Now there are a lot of misconceptions about these wise men. First of all, they were wise men. They weren't kings, despite what the song says, right? The word that we use to describe them, the magi, comes from the Greek word for wise men. And so these men were likely astronomers, part astrologers. And we think three, but weren't only three of them. See, we think of three wise men, and the image we see on greeting cards and on signs and pictures and stuff looks a lot like this. Three wise men on a camel, each on a camel, kind of walking through the desert. But in actuality, these wise men who came wouldn't have come alone. They would have come with an entire entourage. Don't think three men on a camel, three men on three camels. Think more of the Prince Ali scene from Aladdin. You remember that? This is what it looked like. There was a bunch of them, a bunch of people who were coming in. They would have had enough supplies to get them there and get them home. There would have been a huge number of people. It would have caused a great commotion when they arrived into Jerusalem. And they came in asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews?" And this was very unusual because babies aren't born king. Babies are born princes, and then they later on become king, but no one is ever born a king. They said, "We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." So, listen, even if you're not a Christian, you've probably heard the Christmas story, right? Or parts of the Christmas story. You've at least sang the songs. And so we know, where was Jesus born? He wasn't born in Jerusalem, right? He was born in the little town of Bethlehem. That's where Jesus was born. So why were the wise men in Jerusalem? If they were looking for Jesus and Jesus was born in Bethlehem, why were they in Jerusalem? Now, there was speculation about this over the years. Some people think that the wise men would never have expected a king to be born in a tiny town like Bethlehem. You know, it was a typical Jewish village, probably had maybe at the most 2,000 to 3,000 people living in it. And so maybe the reason that they didn't go to Bethlehem is because they didn't think they could be in that small town. But they probably went to Jerusalem because Jerusalem was the capital city. It was the center of Judaism in that area, and they would expect that if they saw the signs, that the people who were there, who the prophecy was given to, would see the signs too. That they would see the star too. That they would already be celebrating the King of the Jews being born. That's what they expected. And they were probably very surprised that no one there seemed to know and that no one there seemed to care. It goes on and it says, King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. Herod was probably like, wait, I'm the King of the Jews, right? I'm the King of the Jews. How can a baby be born King of the Jews? I'm King of the Jews. The Romans said that I'm King of the Jews, and fear crept into Herod. Again, here's another threat to his rule, another threat to his kingship, another threat to his identity, to his self-worth. And it wasn't just him that was troubled, right? Matthew says all of Jerusalem was troubled. Now, it could be because of their worry about what a paranoid Herod might do if he thought that there was a baby king out there somewhere. It could be that they were just disturbed because of the Prince Ali-esque caravan that had invaded their city. And Herod might have said, hold on, wait a second. I remember hearing you guys talk about something, right? About this guy that's supposed to come. I think they called him like the Messiah. Like there was a prophecy and he was supposed to come in and free his people from Rome or something like that. And he must have been thinking, wait, who do I ask? Who do I ask about this? He figured it out. Well, let me ask the people who are experts in the scriptures, right? So he says he called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, where is the Messiah supposed to be born? And they answered, in Bethlehem in Judea, they said. For this is what the prophet wrote. And they quote scripture back to him. He says, and they said, and you, O Bethlehem in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah. For a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd for my people Israel. So he's coming from Bethlehem. Now Herod needed to figure out what in the world was going on, and so he had an idea. It says that Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. He was like, hey guys, come on, let's chat for a bit. Can you just tell me what's going on? Like, when did you see the star? When was that supposed to have happened? What's going on here? So he tried to get all the information. And afterwards he told them, he said, listen, all right, it's supposed to be Bethlehem. Bethlehem is where this guy was supposed to be born. So you guys go to Bethlehem, right? He told them, go to Bethlehem and search carefully. Make sure you find him. Search carefully for the child. And when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too. I want to worship him. You're going to worship him. I'm going to worship him. And maybe the wise men said, all right, we're going to go. And maybe the wise men looked at him and said, yeah, right. I'm sure that's what you want to do. Matthew goes on and he says, after this interview, the wise men went their way. And the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. Now, here's some interesting things about this, because a lot of times we think of the stars way up in the sky, right? We see it in the Christmas cards, stars way up there. But the language that Matthew uses kind of gives a different picture, right? So when he says the star went ahead of them, the phrase is actually better translated as the star was hanging in the air. In other words, it wasn't way, way far off. Like there was a light source that was right above them, that was actually leading them. They were following that light source. And when it says that it stopped over the place where the child was, that phrase literally is translated, the light or the star stood over the head of the child. Stood over the head of the child. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. This is the wise men. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Now that's kind of odd, isn't it? Because these are guys, they're probably older men, and they are worshiping Jesus. They are not Jews. They're not Christians. There's no Christians yet. They're not followers of Judaism, but they get there, they see the baby Jesus, and they bow down to worship. They're worshiping a baby. I mean, even if their prediction was right? Even if he was born and he was going to be immediately the king of the Jews, people don't worship kings, right? We honor kings. We take the knee to a king, but we don't worship them, especially if they're not our king. And yet here are these wise men from a faraway land who have come and they are worshiping Jesus. And then it says then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, when we really think about this, it actually kind of breaks a lot of myths about Christmas, right? Imagine you're wise men. You're traveling months to visit a new king. Like you've seen the predictions, you've heard the predictions, the prophecies, you've looked at the star. There's this one star that isn't doing what all the other stars are supposed to be doing. It's clearly leading you to this place. You're packing up all your stuff to go and visit this new king so you can bring him gifts. Are you going to bring him like a gold coin and maybe a jar of frankincense and a small pouch of myrrh? Is that what you're going to bring to this king? No, of course not. When you bring gifts to a new king, right? If you're bringing gold, you're bringing bags and bags and bags of gold. If you're bringing frankincense, there are trunks and trunks and trunks full of frankincense. When you're bringing myrrh, you're not just bringing one clump, you are bringing bushels and bushels and bushels of myrrh because you are giving it to a king. They had brought this all and they left it all with Jesus. Now, we don't know what Jesus' earthly parents, Joseph and Mary, did with all of this wealth, but it's hard to imagine that Jesus grew up, poor, with all of those gifts that he got when he was still a very, very small child. When it was time to leave, the wise men, their entire caravan, they Prince Ali'd themselves out. They returned to their own country by another route. In other words, they didn't go back up to Jerusalem. They went a different way, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. Eventually, Herod figured out that these guys weren't coming back. And it says that Herod was furious when he realized that the wise men had outwitted him. And he thought maybe they warned him. They warned Jesus. Something happened. They did not come back. And, God told Joseph and Mary, listen, something bad's about to happen. You need to take Jesus and get out of here. And they went to Egypt for a while. So now they're living in Egypt when Herod figures out what the wise men had done. And what does Herod do out of his anger? What does he do out of his fear? It says he sent soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem. In and around Bethlehem, who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report of the star's first appearance. So he calculated it all out, and he figured, well, if this baby was born when that star appeared, the wise men said, this is when the star appeared. Okay, so that baby is somewhere between 0 and 2 years old, and so I want you to go in and kill every baby boy 0 to 2 years old. That was the order that he gave. It's what historians refer to as the slaughter of the innocents or the massacre of the innocents. Can you imagine what that was like for the people in Bethlehem? You're there just living your life, and one day soldiers come into town, kick down your door, they search your house, looking for any boy that looks 2 years old or under, drags them outside and kills them. And listen, men, we are notorious for being horrible at guessing ages. And those soldiers would not have wanted to make a mistake. So maybe it wasn't just the 2-year-olds. I mean, they didn't have birth certificates, right? They didn't have ID cards. So if the kid looked 2, they would just make sure. And so there were probably kids as old as 5 that were getting killed. There's been dispute over the years as to how many. There are some accounts that say it was 3,000 kids. Some accounts say 14,000. Some say 64,000. There are some religious traditions that teach that the number was 140,000 little boys were killed. I guess that would depend on, what around Bethlehem would cover. Based on the population of Bethlehem and the surrounding villages, a lot of historians estimate that it was a couple of hundred. But whichever one of those numbers are correct, this is a horrible thing to imagine. That a man could actually do this, that could order the death of innocent boys. But it was completely in character for Herod. Herod's entire justification for his existence was his accomplishment of becoming king of the Jews, of keeping his title as king of the Jews, of all of the things that he did for the people in that area. And it ended up costing him everything. It cost him his wives, it cost him his sons, it cost him the respect of Rome, it cost him the respect of the nation that he ruled. And he knew it. When Herod was about to die, and from his symptoms, historians believe that he either had intestinal or pancreatic cancer. When he was about to die, he gave an order to his sister Salome. And he said for her to go and have all of the Jewish leaders, all of them, locked up in a hippodrome, an outdoor stadium. I want you to lock them up all there. And on the day that I die, the moment that I die, I want you to have them all killed. Josephus records what he said. He says, this is Herod speaking. He says, I know the Jews will greet my death with wild rejoicings and be so happy. But I can be mourned on other people's account and make sure of a magnificent funeral if you will do as I tell you. These men under guard, the ones that are in the hippodrome, those religious leaders, as soon as I die, kill them all. Herod knew that the only way that people would mourn on the day that he died is if they were mourning for someone else. And he said, that's better than nothing. So get all these people that people love, people respect, people follow. And on the day I die, kill them too, so that people will mourn on the day I die. Even if they're mourning for someone else, I want them to mourn. Herod died, and Salome disobeyed him, and she ended up releasing all of the prisoners. It's a tragic story, really. Herod had so many accomplishments, so much success, so many things to be proud of, but in the end, he would be known all throughout history as the king that ordered the slaughter of the innocents, as the king that tried to kill Jesus. He wouldn't be known for his accomplishments. He wouldn't be known for his successes. He wouldn't be known for all of the things that he was able to build, the legacy that he left behind. None of that. And since then, every year at Christmas time, as people all over the world tell the story of Jesus, tell the Christmas story, they'll talk about the shepherds. And they'll talk about the star in the sky. They'll talk about Mary and Joseph and the manger and Bethlehem and no room at the inn. They'll talk about the wise men. But they'll also talk about the great villain, Herod the Great. The man who forever would be known as the king who tried to kill the baby Jesus. Now I know you and I, we can't even imagine doing something like that, but see, here's the thing. If I believe that all I have is because of me, to keep it, I'll do anything. But if I believe that all I have is because of God, then I will trust Him with everything. See, we don't need to be at the same level of Herod to let that same attitude blind us from what God is doing in our lives and from what God wants to do in our lives. Every one of us has to decide what we are going to place as the foundation of our life. What is going to be the foundation of our identity, of our self-worth? What is going to be the justification for our existence? And sure, we can make ourselves the foundation of our life. We can make ourselves the justification of our existence, but then we will always live in fear that it won't be enough. We'll always live in fear that we won't be accepted. We'll always live in fear that someone is going to come along and try to take it away. Or we can do what one of my favorite pastors and speakers and authors often said. Charles Stanley says, "Trust God and leave the consequences to Him." Trust God and leave the consequences to Him, good or bad. Trust Him. And then you can live your life knowing that whatever the consequences are, however life takes you, through the ups and the downs, you can leave the consequences to Him.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.